Hi everyone. This video is going to go over the dominant approaches to sociology. You'll see a bit of this in the textbook in chapter 1, and you're also going to Hi all. This video is going to go over some of the dominant approaches to sociology and really focus on the three dominant ones. Now, you're going to get a bit of this in the textbook. You're going to be reading chapter 1 this week and next week. And that is also going over more of the history of sociology, which I'm not really going to cover in this video. But I just want to make sure you have a sense of these are the dominant perspectives you should know about by the time you leave this course. And you're going to see a lot of the other stuff we do falls into one of these three dominant perspectives or a mix between the three. So before we get into that, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. And again, you're going to see this in the book in chapter 1 this week. However, sociology is, if you break down the word to the most basic level, and this is often a good place to start, social or society, and then study of or story of. So those are two different things, but it captures a lot of what we're doing, right? The story of society. You're looking at what is the narrative that surrounds this giant entity that we're all part of. Or the study of the social. The social is the thing we engage in. The people within this society engage in social actions. You could tell the story of the larger society, or you could look at a study of the interactions themselves. Now, sociology falls between a number of different disciplines, right? There's overlap with all of these. There's clear connections to geography, especially cultural geography, which looks at where people come from, what they do, the networks between people, very sociological. Sociology shares a lot with looking at economics, history, marketing, psychology. You'll see that connection spelled out in the chapter. We could talk about that more if you're interested. One of the reasons that sociology makes an excellent double major. Sociology more and more is drawing on biology, but they often do it through psychology. And the way that happens is the way your brain works, the way your cognitive function occurs is psychological, but draws on biological processes. Sociology wants to know how we learn, how we reproduce ideas. So it does draw on biology, probably not as much as it should. That's one of the directions sociology is going in the future. Sociology shares a lot with philosophy. Some of the first sociologists actually were philosophers, right? If you look back at Socrates, Confucius, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, they're all doing sociological things. Now, there are two key differences between sociology and philosophy. The first one is philosophers would often say what society should be, right? They're imagining a better version of reality. They're thinking about why it is the way it is, but they're focused on what could be. Sociology really wants to be the scientific pursuit of understanding what actually is, not what should be. Now, in critiquing the current day, it might lead to understanding a better future, but it's focused on what is actually happening. Related to that is the second thing that separates sociology from philosophy, which is empirics, right? There's always data. Philosophers exist at an abstract level. Sociologists, even if they're thinking about a philosophical concept, they want the data. How do we prove this? When we talk about methods, which is the next unit, or maybe the third unit, I'm having trouble remembering right now, that's specifically how do we know what we know? We have to gather data. We have to gather evidence. It can't just be this abstract idea. So in that sense, sociology is a science. Much like any other scientific discipline, it's about gathering evidence, coming up with these arguments, coming up with a thesis, coming up with a hypothesis, and then being able to test it, right? We keep on building. Science is always an ongoing project. Science never says what is. Science proves what is not. It's a little twist, but in a sense, you're trying to come up with something, some idea, and then you keep gathering data to get a better and better understanding, but it's never actually perfect. Science is just the best way we have of trying to get that understanding. Now, sociology is different than other sciences in a few key ways. First, society is always changing. If you measure, let's choose a random element, nitrogen in 1900, and you measure the qualities of it, it'll be the exact same as you do if you do it now, right? Doesn't matter. The 120 years makes no difference in the qualities associated with nitrogen. Society is not that case. People change. People think in different ways. Societies are run in different ways. Governments function in different ways. All these elements of the social happen in different ways. So that's a key change. The other challenge is sociologists are a part of the world we analyze. That always introduces a degree of bias. There's different ways of responding to that bias. One is to try to be as objective as possible. The other way is to try to be as honest as possible about what that bias could be and share it with the people reading your research. The other thing that's key is it's hard to predict the actions of a human, right? People act in different ways. You can't always expect what people are going to do. You've probably had these situations. You say hello to someone, you do something related to someone, and you expect them to act a certain way. They act a different way. You can't always predict it. Maybe you say hi to someone one day and they say hello back. The other day they're in a bad mood. They say something completely different. Hard to predict what humans actually do. Again, different than if we're working with some sort of chemical compound. It's also harder to control the variables. In science, the goal is often to remove any outside influence, right? To make sure that the thing that you're looking at, how does X affect Y, is not affected by anything else. Sociology is hard to do that, right? We can't put a group of humans in glass walls and observe them all day. That would be ethically wrong. It would be an awful thing to do. If I want to study how people develop religious belief, I have to study this complex society as a whole. I can't remove the people and the religion from the rest of society. All right, so the big questions or goals that really unite every sociologist and everything we study, there's three. First, making the ordinary strange and the strange ordinary. There's going to be a lot of that in the first 2 weeks of class, right? Taking things that we take for granted and saying, well, why are they this way? If they weren't this way, if I came from a different place, they actually would seem pretty strange, right? The music that we take for granted, pretty strange to listen to. The ways that we eat, the ways that we interact, the ways that we dress, all those things could be seen as strange. And making them strange, it allows us to pick apart the details and start to make new connections. Related is we try to make the strange ordinary. So when we look at things different than the way than what we're used to, different than the way that we were raised, instead of just saying it's strange and weird, instead we want to say, oh, what does it actually share with our society? What can it tell us about how the social works? Maybe those people do this ritual and I do this ritual. Are they doing the same thing? Second big question, what holds us together? This seems like an important question right now, right? Our society seems to be breaking apart in numerous ways, in many different fissures. So the question is, why doesn't society just crumble? Generally, social change is very slow. Generally, societies remain the same way they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Small changes, but they often remain the same. Why is that, right? So what can create some sort of stability? The other question is, what does cause that change? We do see change happen, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. What leads to it? If you're interested in social movements, you'll be very interested in this question, right? If you have some vision of what society could be, well, you need to study what could lead to change, right? If you're worried about society crumbling, you also need to ask this question. What's leading to it breaking apart? When you're doing any research, you'll be looking at 3 different scales. You could conduct the same study, look at the same topic, but at 3 different scales. Scale means how large the project is, right? How narrow that data is that you're interested in. If it's micro, let's choose an example. Education. Say you're interested in studying education. If you're doing a micro study of education, you will focus on individuals. You might look in the classroom itself. You want to know how people actually act when they're learning math, how the teacher presents certain concepts. Do girls and boys respond differently? Are they treated differently? How are classes divided up and taught in different ways? What is every little interaction that takes place? That's micro. A meso-level study would be a step up, but still not huge. Maybe you look at 2 different communities and you look at how the education system is a little bit different. So you could look at a school in Pittsford and a school in Brighton, and maybe we'll throw in a school in Brockport and another in Rochester. That would still be a meso-level study. You're looking at individual schools, but it's a bit above the individual. Macro would be looking at a much grander scale. So you can be comparing all the schools across the state or all the schools across the country. In each case, we're looking at education, but we're doing it at different levels. So those are some things to consider. The other thing that's worth knowing before we get into the 3 dominant approaches is that we are all social theorists. That's a really key point. You need to be a social theorist to survive in the world. Every time you go into a social situation, you have an expectation about how other people are going to act and how you are going to act. It's not new data collection each time, right? When you come into a classroom, you know where to sit. You know what way you're supposed to face. When you go into an elevator, you know how to act. When you go into a restaurant, you know how to act. You have certain ideas. Now, sometimes they're wrong. Now, this is the key thing. As we are all social theorists, we engage in lay social theory, which means we have these ideas that are taken for granted. We don't actually do rigorous scientific data collection. Sometimes we rely on stereotypes. Sometimes we deny ideas that go against what we already believe. So in a sense, we're all sloppy sociologists. To be a sociologist means to formalize them, to actually make a claim that you can test, to observe and gather data in a way that is more rigorous and is not simply ignoring things that goes against your ideas, to use methodology in a proper way. So there's some key differences. All right, let's look at the three dominant approaches. Now, these are the approaches in every intro to sociology class you'll learn: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction. Within sociology, these are not the only approaches. Some other common approaches you'll encounter and could even take classes on, specifically on these ideas: feminist theory, so studying gender, studying power related to gender, very important approach within sociology. Postmodern theory, which is a different way of understanding how we actually know about the world, another dominant approach. We won't get into that much in this class. Critical race theory, saying, hey, one of the biggest ways of understanding how society functions and some of the challenges, whether it's about holding groups together or breaking us apart, it's looking at race. It's also looking at how we even define what race is and who people and what races people identify as. So these are all their dominant approaches. We're going to focus on functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction because those are the ones that underlie all the other approaches. If you know that, you're in pretty good shape. All right, the first of the three approaches that we're going to go through is functionalism. The person most associated with functionalism is this French theorist, Émile Durkheim. You don't need to remember that name. If you take social theory, if you take upper level sociology courses, you'll get introduced to him again. Not that important. The key idea here is that each social institution has a function. We'll talk more about institutions next week, but the idea is that everything in society serves some sort of role. It does some sort of work for the way the bigger thing continues to hold together, right? The key question for a function list is, how does the system remain in balance? How do things remain stable? So if we think earlier about those questions, what leads to change, what leads to not change, this is about things not changing. It's all about stability, right? Because for the most part, things tend to hold together. So if someone was looking at society from a functionalist perspective and they're looking at a particular topic or a particular thing like, say, sports, the thing they would ask is, okay, well, we see all these different societies that have some type of sport-like thing. It must be doing something. Otherwise, it wouldn't continue to exist in society. It wouldn't serve such a big role. One way to think about this, here, let me actually draw, I think I can draw a picture right here. Let's try this. Blue color. Imagine you're looking at, it's hard to draw with the mouse, but you'll see, this is a person. And you looked at their eyes. You would say, what do these eyes do? What function do they have? Well, they're to see. And then you look at their heart, and you would say, what function does it have? Well, it pumps blood. And you could look at the lungs, and you could say, what function do they have? Durkheim's doing the same thing about society, right? That's a way to think about it. So change happens when one thing is disrupted, when there's a drastic change to religion, when there's a drastic change to education, when there's a drastic change to the military. All the other parts of society adapt to this. So when one thing changes, others change along with it as a response. Or there could be a shock to the whole system. But the key here is we're trying to figure out, how do things generally stick together? So the question for functionalist is, what job does it do for society, and how does it play a part in society functioning? Next theorist is conflict theory. This is most famously associated with Karl Marx. Now, the key part here is it's not Karl Marx in his theories of how communism works. That's not really what we're interested in at this point. Instead, he's someone who offers a critique of capitalism. In particular, he points out that the reason social change occurs, so instead of stability, we're not talking about stability, we're talking about change. The reason change occurs is because people fight over resources. There's not enough resources for everyone, especially in the system that we have. And so people want to get more of those, or at least they want more than they have. That leads to change. And when you look at the society that exists, it often functions in a way where the people in power hold more of those resources, and they design a society that allows them to continue to have more resources or to even gain more. So not just to hold on to more resources, but then to maximize and increase the resources that they have. Now, from this perspective, if you're looking at something, you wouldn't say, how does this help society stick together and remain stable? Instead, you would say, how does this system serve certain people more than other people, right? If you're looking at something like school, you might say, well, what lessons are being taught in school? Are all schools teaching the same lessons? Do people with money go to better schools and people with less money go to schools that do not set them up to do as well in the system? Any of those questions might be asked, right? So with Durkheim, with the idea of a functionalist, they would say, okay, what does school do? It teaches key values. It holds us together by teaching shared ideas. It provides a common history. Marx would come along and say, or a conflict theorist, and say, okay, but is that really what's going on? Are there inequalities that exist in this system? So that's the focus. The third approach, which initially seems the most complicated, I think it will seem the most complicated, but will make a lot of sense by the time we're done. We're going to get into symbolic interaction, I think in 3 weeks or so, maybe 4 weeks. But in symbolic interaction, the idea is that reality is made up by exchanging meaning. And to exchange meaning, we're always sharing symbols with each other, which communicate something bigger. It could be language, right? Language is the exchange of symbols that hold meaning. When I say a word, you know the thing I'm pointing to with that word, and it carries meaning to you. If I speak in a different language, if I start speaking in Spanish, if you speak Spanish, those symbols will also communicate meaning. If you don't speak Spanish, they won't. We are always interacting and exchanging symbols. Language of a sort, but it's not always spoken language, right? Me wearing a suit communicates something to you. Me wearing cut-off jeans communicates something different. Me raising my voice in anger, it communicates something different. I shouldn't have even said anger. Me raising my voice might communicate anger. Me speaking softly would communicate something different, right? We're always exchanging symbols, and we're always reading symbols. When you walk into a room and you look around, you might say, who might be my friend here? Who would I get along with? We might choose by a number of different qualities, but we're engaging in symbolic interaction, right? Interacting with the world, looking for symbols that have meaning. People most associated with symbolic interaction. We've got W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the other founders of the discipline. So really, I would say the big three in sociology would be Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. We didn't talk about Weber. Don't worry about remembering these names. I'm just pointing this out. People often say Marx, Weber, Durkheim. The other one who really deserves credit, W.E. Du Bois, really the founder of symbolic interaction. Also the person who first brought in the study of race into sociology. The other person associated with symbolic interaction who we'll read in this class is a person named Irving Goffman who wrote in the 50s, so a little bit more recent.